Hello, and welcome to episode 145 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with Jennifer Bevan Dangle, the Executive Director of Common Cause Maryland, who has 10 years' experience working in Annapolis with the Maryland General Assembly. Jennifer is also an attorney. Jennifer, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
Excellent. The first thing I'd like to ask you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, Common Cause Maryland works to make sure that our democracy is responsive to what the public wants. So we really think that our work is at the core and center of the public interest, because if our elected officials are listening to everyday citizens instead of special interests, then we think that a broad suite of reforms can move forward that the public supports.
Now, on that topic, could you define what special interest is and perhaps maybe address whether you are a special interest group and why elected officials should listen to you as opposed to individual constituents who reach out to elected officials on their own?
Certainly, and it's a very good question. We do use that word special interest, and it gets bandied around quite a bit. When we say it, we're thinking about any entity that is trying to exert special influence, money, lobbying, donations to campaigns, taking out delegations to fancy dinners. Those entities that have that kind of money-based interest, and ultimately they're seeking to advance something that would benefit them directly. So a corporation spending a lot of money on campaigns and lobbying in the hopes that they'll get favorable tax breaks, for example. In some ways, we are a special interest. We're registered lobbyists. I am, year after year, a registered lobbyist in the state of Maryland. And so we do, in some ways, fit that category. But when we talk about special interest, we're thinking about groups that are trying to get a benefit out of what they're advancing. We would love to put ourselves out of business. I would love to wake up tomorrow and say, every voter has full access to vote. There's no fear of money influencing campaigns unduly. Mission accomplished. Let's take the shingle down and go home. So in some ways, we're not a special interest because, again, what we're trying to do is just make sure the process works and there's no benefit back to us if it does or it doesn't.
Now, there have been former executive directors of Common Cause Maryland and various other staff who've joined Public Interest Podcast. For instance, Bruce Adams, who back in the 1980s was quite active with Common Cause Maryland. Yet a lot of the issues that, and there has been significant progress made, what would constitute a day when you could take down the shingle? Because you have made progress, yet you're still in business. There's still things that you care very deeply about. For instance, gerrymandering and campaign finance reform. What would constitute a day when it's mission accomplished and there's no longer a need for Common Cause Maryland to exist in the state?
If we had a system where every candidate for office was running based on small dollar contributions, where we didn't have to worry about these independent expenditures that can spend thousands to influence the campaign from the outside, if our districts were drawn in an independent manner, not controlled by the politicians who benefit from them, and again, if we had full confidence that every citizen was registered to vote and could show up and vote, on election day or during early voting, that all these processes were working, no fear about ethics or lack of transparency in the decision-making process, then we would be able to say mission accomplished. Now, we're not totally convinced we'd ever see that day fully, because every time we pass laws, and as you say, we have a 40-year legacy, lots of progress that's been made, but every time you pass a law, you find new loopholes or money finds a new way to run around it and get into our system. So although we have been working on these issues for a while, it's a constant battle of plugging the torrent of water over here, and then it finds ways to leak in over there. So it does take vigilance to make sure that our democracy is fully functioning.
Now, on the topic of every citizen being registered to vote and then showing up, there's a long history in the United States of having a smaller proportion than who is eligible to vote, registering to vote, and then a much smaller proportion of those, actually turning up and voting. And of course, you can see data, for instance, of, I think about 12% of registered voters across the United States voted for either Trump or Clinton in the primaries last year, and of course only about half of all of the American population voted at all in any of the elections last year. And with gerrymandering, which is partisan drawing of districts, you find that primaries are increasingly the real competitive race for many elections, and yet with primaries you find even reduced turnout, even in the most educated and wealthiest areas of the country and of the state. So how do you propose, how does Common Cause, what are your kind of ideas about how to increase informed voter turnout given such a long history of having low voter turnout proportionally compared to other countries, and there's almost an inverse relationship between expenditure of money, the more money you spend, and voter turnout. The more money you spend, the less people vote. So how does Common Cause propose to increase informed voter turnout?
It's a really tricky question, and I think that we have to take some of the easy, simple steps, but we also have to start looking at some of the harder and potentially much more complicated steps. Easy things we could do this legislative session: election day voter registration, or even the newest modern way of registering, which is automatic voter registration. Making sure that everybody who wants to vote when they wake up the morning of election day is able to go, and that nobody is stalled or stopped by thinking, well, am I registered? Did I update my address? I don't know. I'll just stay home. Right? So making sure that those unnecessary logistical burdens and barriers are gotten rid of. Another step that's a little bit of a bigger step would be to look at systems such as vote by mail. Colorado recently passed a comprehensive set of reforms that basically say, however you want to vote, whenever you want to vote, we're going to make it easy for you. And so you could go vote in person, you can go vote early, you can go vote by mail. And that type of system, again, it makes sure that everybody who's interested is able to go. There is an interesting,
No, please continue.
There is an interesting negative relationship between all this negative campaign mail, negative campaign ads, and voter participation. And it's very unfortunate because the negative campaigning does turn out your base. It riles people up, and it does help you win your primary. But we're seeing that it also lowers overall voter participation because people get really turned off by it. So another reform that needs, unfortunately, Supreme Court intervention is to help get control back of third-party spending, this unlimited expenditures, because third parties are even more likely to go, these independent spenders are even more likely to go negative than the candidates themselves. And ultimately, we need to look at the pieces of our election that are causing such extreme voter cynicism. Gerrymandering, where the politicians control the lines. Things, very modern reforms such as runoff ballots, where the top two vote getters move on to the general regardless of party. There are different ways to make sure that voters feel the elections are truly competitive and that the elections are truly responsive to their vote. Whereas right now, the number one reason we hear from people, why didn't you vote? They say because they feel the system's rigged. And getting at that is something that politicians are going to need to start taking a very hard look at.
So you mentioned that Colorado voters can vote by mail, and I believe also in Oregon voters can vote by internet. Do you have any information on whether that has actually increased voter turnout, or have those reforms been passed so recently that there's no data available yet?
We've only started looking at them because right now Maryland can't do either, unfortunately. We don't verify signatures, so we can't yet do a vote-by-mail system. And the internet voting question raises so many concerns around security and cybersecurity that the system's just not prepared for it. But as we've looked at these different systems, and some of it's anecdotal, people who live in the western coast states that tend to have vote by mail, there does seem to be a boost to voter participation because it's easy. And also, people feel they can make an informed decision. Pure anecdotal evidence, my brother lives in Washington State. He loves that he can sit at his living room table, go through the ballot, research the candidates, and really make an informed vote. And that's one of the reasons you see such higher participation in the general than in the primary. Because when a person walks into that voting booth, too often they see all these names, and unfortunately, they don't know who all the different candidates are, despite the mailers they might have gotten. So making it easier for voters to feel educated, to feel informed, that does make it easier for them to vote.
So you said that some voters feel as though the system is not responsive to them and the electoral system is rigged. Now, in Montgomery County, Maryland, 37.5% of the delegation, meaning the delegates and senators that represent districts located within Montgomery County, Maryland, have actually been appointed to so-called elected office at some point in their lives, either to the Maryland House of Delegates or to the Maryland State Senate. Can you speak about whether that provides some kind of idea in people's minds that the system is rigged, and whether the system is indeed rigged, if that's a metric for determining whether the system isn't really responsive when only that 1 in 3 of the elected officials representing Montgomery County have actually been appointed to elected office at some point in their lives?
It's certainly an area of significant concern for Common Cause, and one that we've been working to address. And luckily, Maryland did pass a very small step forward on the ballot last year, so that at least some of our statewide offices will have a bit more public say when they come, if a vacancy occurs. But addressing this issue of special elections for delegates and senators is something that the legislature really does need to take seriously. Right now, if there's a vacancy, the Central Committee, the party, basically meets in a room, may or may not take public input. We saw some cases where there was good public vetting in this last round of appointments. We saw some cases where there wasn't, unfortunately. And then they nominate. And as you say, it's about 30% of the Montgomery County delegation, it's about 20% statewide when we look at all the delegates and senators. At any given year, about 20% were initially appointed to those seats. And then they become an incumbent, and they run as a slate, and they're very likely to be reelected. And that does weaken the tie between that candidate and the citizens. That candidate is going to feel more answerable to the party and the infrastructure that got them there than they are to their communities. And so that's certainly a weak link in our chain.
Does it say anything about the electorate, to what extent is the electorate culpable when incumbency is something that's too powerful for any other opposition to overcome?
Working in Maryland, we do have a fascinating disconnect between our everyday citizens and the legislature in Annapolis. And it's very funny because when I talk to my colleagues from other states, they have the opposite. They have citizens who are very connected to their local and their state elected offices and not paying attention to their national. Well, here, everybody feels that they're a resident of national politics. I think we have a very hyper-engaged in many ways, but focused on that national level because D.C. is right in our backyard. And too often we do see that the State House is a mystery to people. They're not paying as much attention as they should. It's a 90-day session. It comes and goes so quickly. Reporting coverage is not as deep as it used to be. And so you do see this disconnect where people, when the primaries come around, think, oh, I don't know, are my delegates doing what I want? I guess so. I think they're all fine. And so we do tend to see a high reelection rate. And I think that speaks more to this need for deeper news coverage, certainly, efforts like yours to have podcasts to get the word out of what's happening in the State House, and groups like ours who do lobby trainings and try to make sure that people understand that the State House really matters. It's making decisions that impact your everyday life.
So I'd like to transition a little bit to your life, Jennifer, and how you got to be where you are now as Executive Director of Common Cause Maryland. There was a time when you wanted to be a veterinarian. You had some mentors. In high school, you took AP Government with John Kirby, and you're on a debate team with Ron Stafford. Can you speak a little bit about the influence that your mentors had or on your path to work towards good governance, or any other kind of reasons why you ended up wanting to be a veterinarian and moving towards this path with Common Cause?
Yes, it's funny. It's the greatest heartbreak of my mother's life is that I did not become a vet and guarantee her free veterinary care for all eternity. But when I went into high school, it was exactly as you said, my AP government class, my debate coach, who made me realize, how much fun politics is, and really set me on a different course that I've been incredibly grateful for. And it shows the value of civics education, which is another thing that Common Cause has worked on in the past few years. But making sure that students get exposed to government and how it works in a very real way, not just we have 3 branches of government and kind of that dry sense of it, but making sure that they see it in action, that they see the impact it has on their lives. It can really increase engagement. And once you get people engaged in a young age, that's one of the things that has been proven. They're much more likely to stay engaged, to stay voters, and so you really get them for life.
How did John Kirby and Ron Stafford demonstrate to you as a student that politics has an influence on your day-to-day life?
I still remember some of the exercises we did, especially in that AP government class, looking at laws that impact students. Can the government search your locker? One day he took the whole class to the top of the stairs, and obviously he didn't actually push anyone down. But we had this whole conversation about, what if one of you fell down the stairs? Who's liable? What if I pushed you down the stairs? Who's liable? And so it made it much more real. It really put it into context. And then debate, I encourage any student to get into debate. It's a great confidence builder. It really teaches you to be logically organized. And I'd love to hear myself talk. So certainly that influenced my desire to get into the lobbying field as opposed to something that was more dry and technical or just writing treatises all the time.
Did you? What happened after college? Did you just wake up and become executive director one day, or did you start as a lower level lobbyist? How did you end up making the transition from being inspired to be engaged in civics in high school to being where you are today?
I think one of the hardest choices facing students who know that they want to get into politics is the choice I face, which is, do I go for a law degree? Do I go straight into the work after school, or do I go for a public policy degree? I went for the law degree, and I'm very glad I did. And some of the reasons that influenced me, one, so many of our legislators are attorneys. And so there is sort of a community and a sense of feeling that you're on par when you have that same level of degree. Also, I really enjoy the bill drafting and the reviewing the bills, reviewing the amendments. I like that kind of deep policy work, and I do think that the law degree helps with that. However, I will say, even though I did the law degree route, we counsel some of our interns who are on the fence about these decisions that anymore a public policy degree might be the better choice for them. We're just seeing such significant, nearly astronomical debt that you come out of law school with. Mm-hmm. And the public policy degree gives you the same tools. It gives you the same ability to do this work. So I do say now to a lot of people, well, if you're not looking to get into a courtroom, you might not want that law school debt just to be able to have, the JD after your name. And certainly my first job out of law school, when I graduated, they gave a survey, and you had to fill in your pay scale. Well, my pay scale was so low, it wasn't even on that survey. And I started off just as a generalist, working for Environment Maryland as a staff attorney. What that really meant was do it all. I did grants. I did major donor appeals. I did member appeals. I did action work to our members. I helped with the social media page. And I did the lobbying and the policy work and the coalition building on our campaigns. And that's one thing I will say. That position was invaluable because it did give me a taste of everything in nonprofit life. And I think that more than anything put me on the track to be an executive director because I had a grounding. How does a budget work? How does a board work? Even though I wasn't directly responsible for some of those pieces, it was a small shop. And so I got to see how it all happened. And then I was able to basically just work my way up until this position opened and I became executive director with Common Cause.
So speaking about seeing how it all works and being responsible in small shops for kind of doing everything across the board, you have in 2014 you organized a Gerrymander Meander race, which is an interesting publicity stunt that you did to call attention to redistricting efforts in the state of Maryland. You are also a self-described official troublemaker. Can you speak for a moment about how you got the idea for the Gerrymander Meander, what that was all about, and how that plays in as being an official troublemaker in the state legislature?
Yes, I will say that Meander was probably the most complicated and time-consuming endeavor that we've ever tried to pull off, and it was absolutely worth it. But I was incredibly lucky that we just found the right people to partner with. And it was actually a coalition. We worked with the League of Women Voters on basically all of our issues, and certainly on redistricting reform. And one of the League members in a meeting said something along the lines of, wouldn't it be great to really show how crazy these districts are? And I don't know if he said to run around it or, what his specific idea was, but that was really the genesis of it, was this almost offhand comment. That, we all kind of laughed. We thought, oh yeah, that would be so funny. And then we almost let it go, because how on earth do you do that? How on earth do you get around an entire legislative district? And then I had the amazing good fortune to run into a gentleman named Tom Kornfeld, who's a former professor at the Naval Academy, who's now retired and is, I believe, president of the Annapolis Striders. So he's a ultra-distance runner. He organizes races, very involved in the running community here. And I was chatting with him about this concept, and he loved it. And he did much of the logistics of mapping out the course. He pre-ran almost every segment, and that's something that not many people realize, that, this one person, sometimes with a friend, sometimes on his own, he plotted up the district lines, and he would run the different pieces just to get a sense of what exactly the course should be. And then he helped us fill a van with crazy runners to spend 3 days together actually running the outline of District 3 in relay fashion. And so
what was the result of that?
As a result, I really do believe we elevated the issue far above what it had been before. And this is one of those frustrating things for advocates when they're just getting into Annapolis and they really passionately believe their policy is important, but they don't know how to make it pop. They don't know how to get it on the radar screen. After the relay, we had the lieutenant governor and also a representative from then candidate Brown's campaign speak at the closing, ceremonies. And the governor, the very next session, made it part of his State of the State, and it became part of the governor's package. And I'm sure that, we can't claim full credit. It's not as though redistricting reform isn't something that's been on Republicans' minds. But I think that giving that public awareness boost behind it really made the difference to elevate it to that level. And so troublemaking, we're always careful to say, legislators are people. You have to treat them with respect. You have to be in Annapolis and be respectful of the process and all of its craziness. But how do you cause trouble in a way that gets positive attention to your issue? Can you do, a big crazy relay? Can you do a big crazy event or a stunt? We have shirts now, and we have our little pterodactyl outfit. So there's lots of creative ways to make your issue pop. And that's sort of the fun of the legislative session, is coming up with some of that out-of-the-box thinking.
So just for our listeners, Jennifer just mentioned pterodactyl T-shirts. That's in reference to the 3rd District of Maryland that she ran around, which was described by a federal judge as being a broken-winged pterodactyl. Jennifer,
that's correct.
I would like to, as we approach the end of this podcast, ask you a final question. You said that speaking to advocates, that advocates often come to Annapolis very passionate about their issues, but have difficulty sometimes figuring out how to gain traction and make their issue pop. I'd like to ask you to speak to those advocates now, and I'd like you to speak to them about your motivations and what you hope your legacy will be and how they ought to be effective in the state legislature.
That's a great question and a huge one to wrap up with. The saying in Annapolis is it takes 2 to 3 years to pass a bill, and we always joke it takes 10 years to pass a common cause bill. One of the legacies I'm most proud of is we've really fixed that 10-year lag time that the organization used to face. I think our advocacy, the strength of the team that we have now, the strength of our members, we've turned the dial up. And when we have a legislative session, we're typically able to move 1 or 2 big reforms that we hadn't been able to get before. And I'm incredibly proud of kind of changing that nexus between our agenda and good government work and our ability to win and to make reform. I am obviously so motivated by my kids and wanting to make a democracy that they'll be proud of. And I think that most people who do public interest, it really is about your legacy, and it's about what you're leaving behind. And all I can say is just never give up. Never, ever give up.
And that has been Jennifer Bevan Dangle, who is the Executive Director of Common Cause Maryland, who has 10 years experience working in the Maryland General Assembly, is an attorney and who speaks about the importance of working to create a more responsive government. She speaks about the importance of civic education as a means of promoting long-term civic engagement. She works every day to create a larger amount of small dollar contributions so that politicians are accountable to the electorate instead of large dollar contributors and special interests who do donate so much to campaigns. She's interested in creating independently drawn legislative districts. She wants every citizen to be registered, to show up and vote and make their voice heard. She wants transparency in government, a more ethical government. She wants same-day voter registration, increasing voter turnout, reducing third-party spending. She wants citizens to feel as though their government is being run through competitive elections and that elected officials are responsive to their vote. For Jennifer, working on campaign finance reform, gerrymandering reform, these things can get a little bit wonky. She loves getting into the weeds, but what she really demonstrates through her life of service is that though these may be very wonky and in the details, they have profound implications on the lives of everyday Marylanders. And for Jennifer, ensuring that we pass a better, stronger, more democratic Maryland to the next generation is perhaps the most worthwhile legacy that one can leave. So, Jennifer, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And this has been episode 145 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. I'd like to remind you to subscribe at publicinterestpodcast.com, listen on iTunes, SoundCloud, Blueberry, Player FM, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Stitcher. Should you wish to speak to Jennifer, you can call 240-630-0380, and that voicemail will be emailed over to her. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time.